I was looking at the schedule, and I think it makes sense to take exam 3 and move it onto the Monday instead of having it on the Wednesday where it is. So I'm going to move exam 3 onto Monday, 4/27. Maybe I should put that as an official, write it on the board. Monday. I figure that both you and I will then have the weekend to get this thing together or get ready to take it. So that is, and that also gives us a little, and I'll let you know as we'll probably continue talking about stuff that won't be on this exam. So I'll tell you where the cutoff is, where the material stops that will be officially, or that you'll be responsible for on exam 3. So that's that. Exam 3. What else do I have here? Back. During lab, we'll also talk about the research project a little more and go over, finally looking over some of the green tea research papers, and there's a bunch of things we should talk about, things where people didn't do them quite right, and we should talk about that explicitly so you have that information as you're going forward in your main research project. So we'll be going over that in lab time. We'll be talking about some other stuff, going over the heart stuff a little more, but there's no official lab for Monday, for today. And cardiovascular continued. So we're basically gonna finish up the cardiovascular system, hopefully today. There's a variety of things we need to discuss here. One, I'll go to my typing tool because it's just so much more efficient. We're gonna continue regulation of blood pressure. We're going to talk about a few more aspects of it, both neural and chemical, long-term and short-term, and then how they all kind of interrelate. So we're going to take stuff we've already been talking about with, adjusting resistance, with, vasodilation and vasoconstriction. We're going to talk about cardiac output, and then we're going to bring in other things as well and look at how they all interact with each other to regulate your blood pressure. Then we're going to talk about blood itself. And we'll talk both about the cells, the plasma. We're going to talk about hemostasis, which is how your platelets work with the rest of your system to repair damage to blood vessels. Your blood vessels are constantly getting little tears, and you got to make sure you fix that so you don't leak from the inside. So we'll talk about that. That'll be part of blood, since that comes out of the platelets, which are part of the formed elements in the blood. We're going to talk about vessels. Again, arteries, veins, capillaries, how they're similar, how they're different. And then also a bit about, we've already talked about, blood pressure, always we talk about on the arterial side. By the time you get to the venous side of circulation, the blood pressure is really low. Like by the time you're on the other side of a capillary bed, the blood pressure is, even on the systemic side, is down to like 20 millimeters of mercury. You know, and that might be down at your feet, and it's got to get all the way back up to your heart. So that blood pressure is not going to be enough to drive the flow of the blood all the way back up to the vena cava and back into the heart on its own. So we'll talk about ways that the blood is kept moving. Like by the time the blood gets back to the vena cava at the heart, it's pretty much 0 millimeters of mercury. It's just kind of falling back into the heart. But there's a variety of things in place that make sure that the blood keeps returning to the heart. We're also going to bring in the idea of the lymphatic system. We'll introduce this because as the blood is going through the capillaries, capillaries are optimized to exchange things between the blood and the tissues, which means that they have to allow things to pass across the walls pretty easy, which means they're leaky. Even your regular old continuous capillaries are pretty leaky. And we'll talk about the mechanisms where most of the fluid that leaks out is actually drawn back in, but you have a net loss of fluid out of your capillaries all the time, like 3 liters per day of fluid that's leaking out of your capillaries. And you gotta gather it back in and dump it back into your closed circulatory system, or you're gonna like have your blood turn to mud, and you're gonna have all your tissues get all inflated with extracellular fluid. So lymphatic system is gonna be important for that. And it's also going to be important for immune function in different ways we'll talk about. So this is kind of our game plan for today. Oh yeah, I could always make it seem like it's some Broadway sign here. So let's continue with the blood pressure. All right. So again, we've talked so far at the core, blood pressure is going to be cardiac out. And here we're talking about kind of your mean arterial pressure. We're looking kind of at the big system of your circulation. So mean arterial blood pressure is going to ultimately be a function of your cardiac output, the flow coming out of your heart, and then the resistance, or sometimes we call this peripheral resistance. Like how much resistance to flow that cardiac output is experiencing. And it's adjusted in general by changing the diameters of kind of the large distributing arteries that are, like the carotids and brachial and femoral arteries. If you kind of adjust their diameter, you're going to adjust the resistance to this flow that's coming out of the heart here. So yeah, we've talked about how peripheral resistance can be, what affects peripheral resistance?
Diameter.
The big part is going to be diameter. Vasoconstriction and vasodilation of those main arteries is going to affect the resistance. What other things did we talk about that can affect the resistance?
Blood volume.
The volume. So no, the volume is going to affect blood pressure in a different way. So it's not going to affect the resistance though.
Viscosity.
Viscosity. So viscosity can affect resistance. The main thing that affects the viscosity is going to be the ratio of fluid to cells. So if you're getting dehydrated and your plasma is going down, your blood is going to get thicker. Or if you're just making more red blood cells, like one of the things that goes wrong when people do blood doping, sometimes people do blood doping, they take erythropoietin, this hormone that increases your red blood cell production so you can have more oxygen carried by your blood so you can perform better. But if you overdo it and you get too many red blood cells and increase the viscosity of your blood too much, that can actually make it really hard to just flow your blood around. So viscosity can play a role. particularly if you're dehydrated or something, but usually it's going to be diameter. Cardiac output. What kind of things affect cardiac output?
Stroke volume.
It's going to be stroke volume and heart rate. Again, the heart rate goes up, the cardiac output goes up. Heart rate goes down, cardiac output goes down. What about stroke volume? What affects stroke volume?
End diastolic volume minus end systolic.
Uh-huh. So you can create a larger stroke volume by either increasing venous return, we talked about, or by increasing the contractile strength of the cardiac muscle, like with, adrenaline, epinephrine. So there's more blood squeezed out by the end of systole. So if this is lower, this is going to be higher. We'll come back. We're going to see this picture I'm drawing here fits into an even bigger picture once I add in a few more pieces into our puzzle here. But this kind of, I don't know, what's it called? Like concept mapping? I think this is like the official pedagogical term. This is going to be useful for you to kind of lay this out so you can really see how these things interrelate with each other. I mentioned it last time. I'll mention it again. There's lots of moving parts, but there is this logical way they connect together. And the more you can kind of get more of an intuition for all these interconnections, the more this will make sense rather than being like disparate things that affect blood pressure. Like if you kind of see how this all fits together, it all becomes much more intuitive. So again, the other big thing that I mentioned that affects blood pressure that's kind of not in here is also blood volume. This is going to be the main kind of long-term control for blood pressure. All these other things are kind of temporary. You speed up your heart, you slow down your heart, you increase or decrease the contractility of your heart muscle, you constrict or dilate your vessels. But the kind of set point, the resting blood pressure where things are when everything's just at their normal settings, that is determined by your blood volume. So ultimately, blood volume is going to be the long-term control of blood pressure. And this is basically going to be controlled by which organ?
The kidneys?
The kidneys. It's actually kidneys. We're going to talk about the kidneys in way more detail, but we're going to introduce a few major things about the kidneys today. Because the kidneys are going to do water balance. Whether you keep water in your body, which keeps your blood volume up, or whether you pee more, which is going to keep your blood volume down. So blood volume, which is controlled ultimately by your kidneys doing water balance. So kidneys are at the core of maintaining your resting blood pressure. So in just a few moments, we're going to see the kidneys playing a very important role in your long-term control of blood pressure. And we'll talk about the different hormones involved and stuff there. All right, so let's get a little more formal here. So there are short-term controls and there are long-term controls. So short-term, that's if you have to bring the blood pressure up or down in the moment. Examples of this would be what we call, so you have this baroreceptor reflex. So baroreceptor, Like a barometer is something that's measuring, the pressure, air pressure. Baroreceptor, these are measuring blood pressure. Baroreceptors are basically stretch receptors in some of your main arteries. They're in your carotid artery, your aorta. The basic idea here is if pressure is higher, the vessel stretches more, right? Pressure is just force per area. Here's your vessel. If pressure is increasing, this thing's going to stretch more. If pressure is decreasing, then it will be less stretched. So baroreceptors are ultimately ways of detecting blood pressure by monitoring the stretch of the arterial walls. They're a kind of mechanoreceptor, but in this context, they're blood pressure receptors. Baroreceptor reflex is basically short-term neural control where the baroreceptors are going to detect a drop in blood pressure. So if BP goes down, there's going to be some integration. Your nervous system is going to say, oh my God, blood pressure is dropping, particularly like if it's in your carotids. If we don't adjust this, you're going to faint because the blood isn't going to have enough force to get up into your brain and keep your brain perfused with blood. So what are going to be these immediate responses to get the blood pressure back up?
They're going to stretch out.
How is that going to bring the blood pressure up?
And if you stretch it, then more blood can flow through. So or maybe the opposite.
So you've got to come back. So this is where you really want to come back to these equations. These equations are going to help you keep this all straight. So this is going to be kind of your kind of home base. So what kind of things could we do if the blood pressure is dropping and we want to bring the blood pressure back up? What can we do looking at this equation to bring the blood pressure back up?
Increase heart rate.
resistance.
Say it again.
Increase heart rate.
You can increase heart rate, which is going to increase your cardiac output. What's another thing we can do?
Increase the end diastolic volume.
That would also increase it. Although and what's another really quick things you could do to increase blood pressure here?
Constrict the blood vessels to increase resistance.
Yeah, and so you constrict, vasoconstriction. So vasoconstriction is going to be this kind of instant way to get the blood pressure back up. Again, imagine your hose. When you put your finger over it, all of a sudden the actual spray, the flow is staying the same, but now it's pushing harder and you can like, psh. So vasoconstriction, one of the classic things they call orthostatic hypotension. Let me put it on a new page just for a second. Orthostatic. Ortho means straight. This means so if you're lying down, you don't need a lot of pressure to get from your heart to your brain because the blood is not fighting gravity. If all of a sudden you're standing up, all of a sudden the pressure you need to get up to your brain is going to need to be a lot higher. And so hypo means low. Orthostatic hypotension is just describing that when you stand up, all of a sudden you don't have enough blood pressure to reach your brain, and you need to do some instant adjustments to increase that pressure to make sure the blood keeps coming up here and you don't faint. And those things we just talked about are going to happen. In an instant, within a single heartbeat, your heart rate's going to go up, and your carotid arteries are going to constrict, and that is going to work to increase the blood pressure and make sure that the blood continues up and you don't faint. What does this word mean? Syncope.
To faint?
Yeah, that's the fancy word for fainting. So if you ever see that word syncope, that just means fainting. So this reflex as you get older, pretty much everything gets slower and not as efficient. This reflex is slower as people get older and older. It's more common for an older person to get up too fast and get a head rush or fall over. So you are relying on this baroreceptor reflex to work really instantly when you are lying down and you step up to make sure your blood pressure continues being adequate to supply the blood to where it needs to go. So this is an example of a short-term kind of neurally mediated reflex or neurally mediated control. Long-term and short-term are not always, we're going to see actually the next thing we're going to talk about is going to affect both short-term and long-term. And it's actually going to be chemically mediated instead of neurally mediated. So what we're going to talk about now is one of the really important things that controls blood pressure called the renin angiotensin mechanism. So let's go there now. Sometimes they call it the renin angiotensin aldosterone mechanism, but I usually just call it this. Sometimes they call it like RAA, even like renin angiotensin aldosterone. Important. We're going to see this is going to be the target of another important class of blood pressure meds. You need to make sure you understand renin angiotensin mechanism. And this is the kind of thing that definitely shows up, say, like on exam 3. I mean, all of this will, but just making sure you know that this isn't just like a tangent. This is a critical part of blood pressure. So this all starts with this signaling molecule called renin. And we're going to talk about the kidney in more detail. There's a particular structure in the nephrons that make up the kidneys called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. We're going to talk about this in more detail when we do the urinary system. For right now, I'm going to just do a very superficial, when blood pressure drops, the kidneys release renin. It gets its name renin. Renal is having to do with the kidneys, the renal arteries, the renal this, the renal that, adrenal gland, renal. So renin just means it's relating to the kidney. Again, we'll talk more about the details of how it actually gets controlled and what part of the kidneys are releasing it when we get to the urinary system. But for right now, kidneys release renin when blood pressure drops. And this is gonna start a whole chain of events. So we need to talk about the different chain of events now. Plasma, which we haven't talked about yet. Plasma has all sorts of different proteins floating around in it that are involved in all sorts of different things. It's going to be involved in transporting things, plasma proteins involved in immune response, plasma proteins involved in blood clotting. One of the plasma proteins that's floating around waiting for its time to do something is called angiotensin 1. So in the plasma, there's this protein called angiotensin 1. Or no, it's called angiotensinogen. Sorry about that. Angiotensinogen. Let me draw that prettier because I am, let me, so whenever you see something called ogen like that, it typically means it's a preliminary version that is going to ultimately get converted into the active form. We're going to be seeing like pepsinogen that gets turned into pepsin when we get to the digestive system. Fibrinogen, which becomes fibrin. Plasminogen, which becomes plasmin. So this is an inactive form. So it's a plasma protein. It's flowing around in your plasma, but it's inactive. And renin is going to be the thing that catalyzes it into its active form. It becomes angiotensin 1. And this is going to be catalyzed by renin. So renin is going to take angiotensinogen, which is this inactive plasma protein, and convert it into angiotensin 1. But we're still not done. Angiotensin 1 is still not our active form. It turns out angiotensin 1 is going to get converted into what's called angiotensin 2. And that is going to be converted by yet another enzyme, which is sitting inside your, it's actually anchored in your lung tissue. Catalyzed by, it's called ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme, which is anchored in lung tissue. So we are, let me keep that. So just kind of giving you these steps again here. Blood pressure drops, renin is released. Renin then is going to convert angiotensinogen into angiotensin 2, and then angiotensin, excuse me, so renin is going to convert angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1, And then angiotensin 1 is going to get converted into angiotensin 2 by this angiotensin converting enzyme, also known as ACE, which is sitting in the lung tissue. And this angiotensin 2 is going to be the active thing that is now going to do a bunch of stuff to help bring the blood pressure back up. So this is the setup. Are there any questions about the setup? We still haven't talked about what angiotensin 2 is going to do. We're just kind of talking about all the steps that led to the formation of angiotensin 2. Okay. So angiotensin 2. So angiotensin 2 is going to do a bunch of stuff. One, it's a potent vasodilator on its own. Not vasoconstrictor. So as a potent vasoconstrictor, what is that going to do just in the short term to the blood pressure?
Increase it.
It's going to increase it, right? If we go all the way back to here, vasoconstriction, increased resistance, increased blood pressure. Yeah, that's kind of a short-term control right there. If we have vasoconstriction, it's going to increase blood pressure. But then it's going to do a bunch of other things. It's going to trigger release of ADH. ADH, maybe let me just do the typer again. ADH means antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin. This is released by the pituitary gland. So ADH is going to be super important in a little bit, and we'll talk about what it does. And 3, it's still angiotensin is going to trigger the release of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. So we have these 2 hormones, ADH and aldosterone are hormones. Again, we talked about hormones when we were talking about epinephrine. What is a hormone again? And we're going to talk about hormones more formally when we do the endocrine system, but they show up. They're going to be at the core part of digestion. They're everywhere. They're not just your endocrine system. What is a hormone? Nobody?
It's like the chemicals released through the blood. So the chemical signal travels through the blood.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a signaling molecule, but rather than being released directly at the target you're trying to talk to, hormones are released into the bloodstream, distributed everywhere, and any cell that has the appropriate receptor is then going to respond to it. So, ADH and aldosterone are hormones. Their targets are going to be, so for ADH has a couple of different roles. One thing is ADH in and of itself is a potent vasoconstrictor. So again, that's going to be more of this short-term control, right? We just talked about how angiotensin 2 was a potent vasoconstrictor, and then it triggers a release of ADH, which is also a potent vasoconstrictor. So both of those are constricting vessels, increasing resistance, kind of bringing up our blood pressure in the short term. ADH also has another really important role. What is ADH? Just from its name, what is a diuretic in general? What does it mean if you take a drug that's a diuretic?
It makes you poop more.
So it makes you pee more. So diuretic makes you pee. Antidiuretic makes you keep the water in your body. So this tells the kidneys to conserve water. This is going to keep your blood volume up. Right? Whoop. Should be an exclamation mark. Boom. It also is going to make you thirsty. How is it going to make you thirsty? What part of your nervous system controls whether you're thirsty or not?
Your hypothalamus.
Uh-huh. Right? If you're thirsty, you're going to drink more water, and you're going to also, that's going to bring your blood volume up. So both of, oh, I didn't mean to do that. Both of these things right here, these are about increasing volume. So this is about long-term control here, as opposed to short-term control. Aldosterone is also going to be this long-term control. Aldosterone tells kidneys to conserve salt. Basically, by pulling more salt in your body, this is going to keep more water in your body. Right, so we'll talk about this in more detail later, but if you're pulling more salt into your body, you are going to have the water follow the salt, right? It's all osmosis. So angiotensin 2 is going to have a bunch of different things going, and you should keep track of them all.
So 2 and 3 are long term, and then 1 is just like a short term.
Right, so 1 is a short term, and actually this vasoconstrictor part of 2 is a short term, and then these and this are long term. So yeah, the fact that ADH is a vasoconstrictor though means it's actually playing both short and long term.
Okay.
And here you can get a sense of why ADH is also called vasopressin, which basically means increasing the pressure in the vessels. Because it actually constricts things. So there's a lot going on here. Are there any questions about this whole big picture I drew here?
Could you go back to the process as a whole, from when it converts angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1, angiotensin 1 becomes angiotensin 2.
Yeah, so that's right here. So or maybe I'll do it in a prettier picture. So basically, in your blood is Angiotensinogen. So this is the precursor, which is just in your blood, in plasma. Renin is going to catalyze that into angiotensin 1. ACE is going to catalyze that into angiotensin 2. And angiotensin 2 is going to do all those things. It's going to be a vasoconstrictor. It's going to cause ADH and aldosterone release. So that's kind of the big picture there.
Thanks.
One of the important class of blood pressure meds are called ACE inhibitors. So you should know what ACE inhibitors are. Again, they are very widely prescribed for controlling high blood pressure. And again, why would inhibiting ACE help keep your blood pressure down?
It's going to stop the vasoconstriction.
Exactly. So we've got a couple of things. One is going to, by not making angiotensin 2, you're not going to have the vasoconstriction from angiotensin 2 or the vasoconstriction from ADH. And what else is it doing? How else is it keeping your blood pressure down?
It's a diuretic.
Yeah, it's by not making ADH and aldosterone, you're going to pee more and your blood volume is going to go down and your blood pressure will stay lower. So the ACE inhibitors are working by blocking any immediate vasoconstriction as well as blocking these processes that would normally increase blood volume. So you should definitely understand ACE inhibitors. Again, I've mentioned before, like 3 meds that people use for blood pressure or for high blood pressure. You know, there's ACE inhibitors, which we just talked about. There's beta blockers. And a beta blocker, a beta adrenergic antagonist. Why would blocking epinephrine receptors on the heart help keep your blood pressure down?
Because the beta or the epinephrine makes the contraction stronger?
Yeah, it makes the contraction stronger, which is going to increase stroke volume, which increases cardiac output. What else does epinephrine do to your heart? Remember, cardiac output was stroke volume times heart rate. What happens?
Your heart rate?
Yeah, remember, part of that adrenaline rush is your heart starts beating faster. So it's going to keep the heart rate and the stroke volume down, which is going to keep the cardiac output down, which is going to keep your blood pressure down. The other main meds that we're going to talk about in more detail when we get to the urinary system are just classic diuretics.
9 a.m.
So diuretics are things that work in the kidney tubules to make you pee more. And if you pee more, it'll keep your blood pressure down and That'll be another way to try to control high blood pressure. So in your text, there is a really nice chart that puts this all together. I went into Cengage. So you all have your Cengage accounts, and I found where is it? Hold on a sec. Oh, dagnabbit. It logged me out. I actually had this all set to go so we could just fly right in. Alas, the best laid plans of mice and men, or whatever. Oh, here we go. We're going to go into our textbook. Let's just go into the ebook. Let's go into blood pressure. This thing right here. So I'm going to actually try to, let me zoom in here if I can. You know, you should be able to look at this picture here and start putting this all together now. And it's pretty nice in that, you know, ultimately we're talking about mean arterial blood pressure and what are all the things that can affect it. Peripheral resistance and cardiac output. We said those were the, you know, that was the main equation. Cardiac output times peripheral resistance is this. What kind of things affect cardiac output? Oh, heart rate and stroke volume. What kind of things affect heart rate? You know, parasympathetic activity, you can slow it down. Sympathetic activity and epinephrine to speed it up. Stroke volume is going to be affected by epinephrine, which is going to increase the contractile strength. We talked about increased venous return can affect stroke volume. Then we also talked about, you know, peripheral resistance is going to be either the arterial radius or the blood viscosity. Blood viscosity can be about the number of red blood cells. So you should go and look in your book, look at these charts, and realizing the sun is washing me out here. You should go and make sure you can see all these connections. Maybe write these connections up yourself so you can recreate them even. So, you know, we haven't gone over every little bit of this, but we've gone over most of this. So I highly recommend looking at these kind of charts like this and making sure that it all kind of makes sense. And if it doesn't, then that kind of gives you something to go back and review a little more, or shoot me a question, shoot me an email or something. So I should mention, before we leave, we're about to leave the heart. But before we do, I want to mention the Frank-Starling Law of the heart. So let me do that briefly. I need to stop sharing here to allow my other thing to go. So here is the heart. Get red. The atria and the ventricles. So So we talked about things that affect the contractile strength of cardiac muscle. We said like epinephrine can make it contract more strongly. Another thing that can actually make the cardiac muscle contract more strongly is being stretched out more before it's being excited. So the more it's stretched out when you excite it, the harder it will squeeze once you excite it. And what that means is if you have increased venous return, remember we talked about increased venous return, sending more blood back into the heart. If you fill the ventricles more than they were, they're going to stretch out more. It means they're going to squeeze even harder than they would have. And they'll make sure that they squeeze out all the blood that's returned. So the Frank-Starling Law of the heart, which is from two guys. There was a guy named Frank and a guy named Starling. It wasn't like, it sounds kind of like some dude named Frank Starling, but it's Frank, I think Dr. Frank and Dr. Starling. The basic idea is that the heart will pump out, all the blood that's returned to it. So that's all this Frank-Starling Law of the heart. You'll read about it. It just says, however much blood is returned to the heart, when the ventricles contract, it will be able to eject that blood that's been returned to it. And again, the mechanism of that is down to the fact that if you stretch out the cardiac muscle more, it's going to squeeze even harder and make sure it squeezes out all the blood that's returned to it. So that's the Frank-Starling Law of the heart. So the other, sometimes when it's Frank-Starling Law of the heart, I think about, some little, those little birds, like, I'm telling you the way it is. Little Frank Starling. It's like, anyway, maybe it's just me. So that is Frank-Starling Law of the heart. So the stuff we've been talking about so far has been about kind of more global control of mean arterial pressure. Let's talk a little bit about local autoregulation of blood flow. So there's also just local controls going on that aren't about overall blood pressure and cardiac output. It's just what's happening in this little part of your tissue right now. So for instance, if just in the tissue, you have, I don't need a fat thing. If in the tissue, you have low oxygen or high CO2, you're just going to have local vasodilation. Which makes sense. If there's low oxygen or high CO2, that means you probably need to bring more blood into that region to deliver more oxygen and take away more CO2. The opposite, if you have high oxygen or low CO2, there's going to be local vasoconstriction. Right? If there's already plenty of oxygen around, then it doesn't make sense to be spending your resources sending blood to that part of your blood. I should mention, this is systemic circuit. What's it going to be like in the pulmonary circuit? Is it going to be the same? Is it going to be different? Any ideas? Why do you send blood to the lungs?
To pick up oxygen.
Exactly, to pick up oxygen. So does it make sense that if there's a lot of oxygen around that you're going to want to constrict the vessels?
No.
No. Right? The whole idea is if there's a lot of oxygen, that's where you want to send the blood, because the job is to pick up oxygen. So this is whole thing in the pulmonary circuit. If there's high oxygen, you're going to vasodilate. Right? If there's low oxygen, that's not where you want to send your blood to, because there's no oxygen there. You're going to vasoconstrict. Right? So it's going to be the opposite. This is going to be the opposite of the systemic, because the job or the role of sending blood there is the opposite. Instead of delivering oxygen, it's to pick up oxygen. So in pulmonary circuit, the local autoregulation like this is going to be the opposite. One other aspect of local autoregulation that is pretty cool is going to come back. I kind of alluded to it when we talked about the things that trigger smooth muscle to contract. So basically, right, so your blood pressure is going up and down and up and down, which makes you think your blood is going to be faster and slower and this and that. But when you get into the little arteries and arterioles going further out into the body, the basic idea here is you have your vessel. And again, what is we haven't really talked that much about. The blood vessel has smooth muscle in the wall. So, blood pressure is going up and down. If we want to think about the flow, it's the same equation what we've just been using, but I'm just rearranging it. Blood pressure over resistance is going to be our flow. As the blood pressure is going up and down, it turns out that the properties of smooth muscle are going to be adjusting the resistance appropriately. When the blood pressure goes up, which means it's stretching the vessel, but smooth muscle is triggered to contract by stretching. So it pushes back and squeezes in. So when the blood pressure goes up and tries to stretch out the smooth muscle, the vessel constricts, bringing the resistance up as well, which is going to keep the flow more constant. When the blood pressure is dropping and the smooth muscle is not stretched out as much, it relaxes more. When it relaxes and dilates, that means the resistance goes down, which again is going to make the appropriate adjustment to try to keep the blood flow relatively constant. So this all basically, keeps flow relatively constant. Because again, when the blood pressure is going up, it stretches the vessel, which reacts by pushing back, constricting, which increases resistance.
So when you are given like a vasodilator, does it like relax those muscles so that they don't start constricting?
Yeah, vasodilators are things that relax muscles like this.
Okay.
Well, vasodilators in general relax muscles. And that's how these vessel diameter is controlled by the smooth muscle. I should mention there's one other thing that happens for kind of control of flow. You know, if kind of chronic, low oxygen, you know, high CO2, you know, if it's just in the moment, you have low oxygen, you send more blood into the region, you vasodilate. But if it's kind of chronic like that, what is the only thing you're going to be able, what can you do?
Give extra oxygen.
But how are you going to deliver it? If you're already like opening up the vessels and you're doing as much as you can and it's still not enough.
Increase blood volume.
So it's going to actually, you're going to have to just make more vessels into the region. We have what's called angiogenesis. So angiogenesis is making more blood vessels. You know, creation of blood vessels. Angio are vessels, angiogenesis. Again, the more tissue, I mean, it's part of the reason also as you get, you know, why is being overweight bad for you? You know, if you are overweight, all that tissue ultimately is going to need more and more blood vessels to supply all that tissue. The more blood vessels you get, we talked about, you know, length of blood vessels being one of the factors of peripheral resistance. So the more extra tissue you've got, the more blood vessels, the more resistance. The more resistance you've got, you know, again, blood pressure is cardiac output times resistance. If you have way more blood vessels because you just got way more tissue, that means your heart's going to have to work harder to keep the flow going. But in general, angiogenesis, your body has an ability to increase the amount of blood vessels into a region if it needs to supply it with more oxygen. So put that in there. Okie dokie. Okay, all right. Let's yeah, since we're talking about vessels, let's just briefly talk about vessels. Arteries and veins. And then we'll also talk about capillaries, but they're kind of their own special thing. Arteries and veins, they have the same basic structure. They basically are a tube. The lining is always going to be this simple squamous epithelium that we call endothelium. So the lining is always going to be simple squamous epithelium. We're going to see when we get to blood clotting and stuff, the way your platelets know something's wrong is that it's not seeing simple squamous epithelium. It's starting to see aspects of connective tissue that are structural elements. So the lining, endothelium. They also call this tunica intima. So sometimes when you're reading about things that are affecting your blood vessels, they'll talk about the intima. Intima is just another synonym for endothelium. And both the intima and the endothelium are actually just the terms we use for the simple squamous epithelium that is lining all of your blood vessels. Then we have the wall. The wall we call the Tunica Media. And it's mainly smooth muscle and kind of elastic tissue. So it's got the ability to adjust its diameter based on the contraction of the smooth muscle. And it's also, depending where you're looking, more or less stretchy based on these elastic fibers. You know, most of the organs, hollow organs that we have, usually have perpendicular layers of smooth muscle. Like when we look at a lot of our other things, we're going to see there's ones that are going one way, one going the other way, things to constrict, things to pooch out. With the blood vessels, you don't really need to have specific muscles that are going to help dilate. All you got to do is relax. And since there's just blood pressure in there, it's going to start opening up. So all you have are these circular muscle fibers, which you can constrict or activate to constrict things and relax, and then they're going to dilate. And for completeness, for completeness, there's this, what we call the Tunica Externa, or the adventitious, just kind of connective tissue on the outside of the thing. Actually kind of fun, really large blood vessels have their own blood vessels that have to supply the tissue of the blood vessel. They call them like the vasa vasorum, which is, I always kind of thought that was kind of fun. That, you know, if you're a small little blood vessel, like a little arteriole or something, all you need is just the blood within the vessel. The oxygen can diffuse into the cells. But if it's a big enough, fat enough thing, they need their, wait, this is, what did, oh God. Vasa vasorum. They need their own little blood vessels to supply. So arteries and veins, they're similar in that they have these basic properties. They've also got some differences. A lot of the differences arise because the arteries are under way more pressure. We're going to talk about this in more detail later. But when you like look at the aorta coming off here, you know, this is like 100 millimeters of mercury, even just kind of your normal. By the time you like enter the capillary beds, the mean arterial pressure is like around 40 millimeters of mercury. By the time you get onto the other side of the capillary beds, the mean arterial pressure is maybe around 20 millimeters of mercury. By the time you get back to the vena cava, you're basically at 0 millimeters of mercury. So the arteries, which are the things that are leaving the heart, I should say arteries leave the heart. But we talked about that before. And just reiterating from before, the pulmonary artery, which goes to the lungs, is blue, right? Because it's the carrying deoxygenated lungs. It's still an artery. But in general, the arteries are going to have to deal with way more pressure. Veins are going to be dealing with much lower pressure. So that is going to really define a lot of their differences. So arteries are going to have much thicker walls, thicker tunica media. These are going to have much thinner tunica media. You don't need nearly as much muscle to adjust your diameter if the blood pressure is really low. Whereas in the arteries, where there's a lot of pressure, you need a lot more muscle to hold your diameter and adjust it the way you want. Another thing about veins if you have low pressure, what is one of the ways to keep the flow going? If I want to keep the flow up, remember blood pressure over resistance, what's the way to keep the flow up if the blood pressure is really low?
Increasing resistance.
If you increase the resistance, that's going to even further,
Decrease.
you want to have decreased resistance, right? Right? If we have increased, remember this is down below. So if you have increased resistance, that's going to be less flow. And that should be intuitive as well. So if we have less resistance, then we'll have more flow. And what's one way we can have less resistance in a vessel?
Relaxing the smooth muscle.
So, and what does that accomplish?
The vasodilation.
Right. So in this case, you just have a larger diameter to start with. These tend to just have larger diameters. Because a larger diameter means there'll be just at its base less resistance, and you'll be able to maintain a flow with lower pressures. So they have larger diameters. Arteries, we've talked a bit about. Arteries have kind of these, some of them are more elastic, like the aorta, the pulmonary trunk. Why is it important that the aorta and the pulmonary trunk, these main hoses coming out of the heart, are very elastic and stretchy?
To absorb the pulse from the heart.
And then what does it do when the heart is in diastole?
Oh, it maintains pressure for the system.
Exactly. Remember, these are the ones that stretch out during systole. Then during diastole, they then kind of compress, and that's what keeps the blood pressure from dropping to zero when the heart is relaxed and refilling. So these major arteries that are leaving the heart, like the aorta and the pulmonary trunk, are very elastic to stretch and absorb. During systole, when there's high pressure, they stretch out, so then they can compress and continue to propel the blood when the heart is relaxing. Most of your other arteries, most of the ones that have the brachial arteries, the radial arteries, the this and that arteries, most of them are what we just call muscular arteries, meaning, most muscular arteries just allow you to change the diameter, so you can adjust the amount of blood flow, you can adjust blood pressure and things like that. So that's what we're going to talk about arteries. Arteries tend to have thicker walls. There's some special ones coming right out of the heart that tend to be very elastic to make sure we continue to propel the blood during diastole. Most of them are more about kind of just strong muscles in the walls to adjust pressure and blood distribution. Veins, we need to talk a little more about, because arteries flow is just going to get driven by the blood pressure. There's enough blood pressure that the flow is going to keep going. Let's talk about blood flow in veins. Keeping blood flowing in low pressure veins. One thing I was saying, they tend to have larger diameters. A larger diameter means less resistance, so more flow. Another really important part is they have these one-way valves, these little endothelial flaps that only allow the blood to move in one direction. But you can see it on your own arm. If you push the blood the wrong, I don't know if I can, I have really good, I don't know if you're gonna actually be able to see it. I doubt it. Like you can actually, on my arms, you can just see the veins start popping out if you try to push the blood the wrong way, because it won't go. And it starts backing up and all my veins start popping out. So as the blood is moving along, it can't go back. Other big thing is all the surrounding skeletal muscle. So skeletal muscle is all over. The veins are going through and around, and the skeletal muscle is contracting and relaxing. So it's basically massaging the veins. And as that happens, you know, if there's some blood here and the skeletal muscle is kind of squeezing in, that's going to splooch that little bit of blood a little further on down the line. And once it's a little further down the line, it can't backtrack because there's a one-way valve. So this massaging by skeletal muscle is a really important way that the blood keeps flowing in the low pressure veins. Another important thing that we're going to talk about in more detail when we do the respiratory system. You know, the way that you drive your breathing is there are pressure changes in your thoracic cavity, using the different, your diaphragm and different muscles of your thorax. The pressure inside your thoracic cavity is going up and down. That's what's driving pulmonary ventilation. This is also where the major veins are coming, you know, the vena cava is coming back up to your heart. So you've got these veins that are in this zone where the pressure is going up and down and up and down. So that's another kind of pumping of the veins. So they call that the respiratory pump. That's basically the pressure changes in your chest cavity, in your thorax as you breathe, actually also help drive the flow of blood back up to your heart. You know, so these are ways we keep the blood flowing in low pressure veins. There's these one-way valves, and then those in conjunction with the skeletal muscle massage as well as this respiratory pump.
Can be able to open.
What's that?
What happens if one of the valves doesn't open and it just remains closed?
So they always open. What happens is, I'll give you a, hold on, turn off your vocal. I'm going to mute you. So what happens more commonly is the valves break down. So if the valve breaks down, then the blood starts pooling and the blood doesn't keep moving. So let me add this. So if valves break down, like this happens in your legs and you just see the blood pooling in your legs but not flowing nicely back up. It's called varicose veins. So it's kind of the opposite of what you were saying, Megan. This is rather than the valves not closing, not opening, the valves aren't working. So the blood doesn't keep moving in one direction. It builds up varicose veins. If you have varicose veins in your anal veins, what do we call that? Anybody know?
Hemorrhoids?
That's hemorrhoids. All hemorrhoids is having the valves in those veins that are returning the blood back not working properly. So then the blood pools in the veins kind of balloon up and all that. So that's hemorrhoids, is varicose veins of your anal veins. I'll give you two more problems with blood vessels and then we'll take a break. If there's a weakening of the vessel wall and it starts ballooning out, what do we call that? So there's something, it's weakened wall, and under the pressure it starts ballooning.
Aneurysm?
Exactly. And these can be really dangerous because if they burst, obviously you start hemorrhaging. An aortic, in fact, that woman, the cadaver that you met briefly, she died of an aortic aneurysm. Basically, her aorta had this ballooning, the weakened wall, and it exploded. And we talked, in fact, we can talk about this in a moment, cardiac output. What is a typical cardiac output? We talked about that last class. What is a typical cardiac output?
Five liters of blood.
Yeah, about 5 liters per minute out of either ventricle. And you have about 5 liters of blood in you. So basically within 30 seconds, pretty much her entire blood supply just got, poured out into her body and she was dead. It's a pretty quick way to go. I had a student who was actually doing an intake with someone as they experienced an aortic aneurysm and just watched them kind of just all of a sudden blank out and drop dead within less than a minute there. So aneurysm, if they catch it before, sometimes they know it's happening either through like angiograms, and then they can try to kind of put little reinforcements around to kind of keep it from bursting. There's other different ways to do it. Sometimes they know because it's putting pressure against different outside structures. But a burst aneurysm is, can be catastrophic, particularly, or if it's an important cerebral artery, it can, if it's a small thing, it could just be like a hemorrhagic stroke. If it's a big thing, you're just going to die right away. The other thing I'll talk about is like atherosclerosis. These are when you start getting both kind of fat and smooth muscle kind of proliferating in the wall of the vessel. So this is what we call a plaque. It's basically kind of fat, I should say lipid. So it's not in the actual lumen. It's not actually, we still have the blood vessel lined with endothelium, but this thing is expanding and growing in the wall, and obviously it's really constricting the diameter, which is going to do what?
Cause a clot?
Say it again?
Would it cause like a blood clot?
No, it's not a blood clot. We'll talk about blood clots later.
It's going to increase blood pressure.
More directly, what's it going to increase?
Pressure, stroke.
Resistance.
Resistance. It's going to increase resistance because it's a narrowing here. So that is going to create a much higher resistance to flow. right? Remember, flow is blood pressure over resistance. You know, at some point you can adjust. If this gets too much, you're just going to not have adequate flow anymore. You know, that's often when people get heart attacks and stuff, is this gets so bad that the blood flow down like your coronary arteries isn't adequate anymore to supply your blood or the needs of the tissue. Sometimes it's called like, you know, the hardening of the arteries. Or one thing that I think is useful to think about is sometimes people talk about, oh, you're like eating all that fat, it's going to stick to your arteries and block up your arteries. You know, there is a correlation between kind of saturated fats in your diet and the incidence of this, but it's an indirect association. It's not like if you're eating a lot of fat that it's sticking inside your blood vessels. Instead, there is this kind of much more indirect process that has to do with inflammation and things like that, that ultimately generate these plaques within the walls of the vessels. So there is a correlation between kind of, you know, diet and fat and things like that in this, but again, it's indirect. It's not, I think, because a lot of times in kind of pop culture, people kind of get this idea that the fat's just sticking in your arteries or something, which is not at all what's going on. But there, again, there is a connection. So any questions?